Talia stepped backward into the corner of his office, her shoulder blades pressing against the cold floor-to-ceiling glass 42 stories above the Chicago River. Caspian Drexel had only moved to stand, pushing back from behind his enormous desk, with the fluid economy of a man who had never once questioned whether he owned every room he walked into. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't reached for her. But Talia's body had reacted before her mind could intervene, the old fear firing through her nerves like a struck match. "Don't," she breathed. The word came out barely audible, scraped thin. Caspian went absolutely still. His eyes dropped, slow and deliberate, from her face down to where her blouse collar had shifted with the sudden movement, exposing the edge of the bruising along her upper arm. Dark, deliberate, the exact shape of a man's grip. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Tell me his name," Caspian said. His voice hadn't risen. It had, in fact, gone lower, flattened into something so devoid of inflection that it carried more weight than any shout. Talia Grayson had spent the better part of 7 years being furniture. It was a skill she had cultivated carefully and deliberately, the ability to disappear into the background of a room, despite the fact that she occupied more physical space than most of the women who worked at Drexel Analytics' Chicago headquarters. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and what her mother diplomatically referred to as substantial. In the real world, in the offices of one of the most powerful private intelligence firms in the Midwest, it translated to the woman the senior analysts talked over in briefings, the one whose insights were recycled through a male colleague's mouth 20 minutes later and praised as original thinking. She had stopped being hurt by it. She had simply gotten very, very good at using the invisibility. Talia's gift was sound, specifically the human voice. She held certifications in forensic phonetics and linguistic analysis from Northwestern, with a secondary specialization in Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, Portuguese, and Spanish. She could identify a speaker from 3 seconds of audio with better accuracy than any automated system the firm had deployed. She could detect stress markers so subtle in a recorded conversation that she could tell you whether a subject was lying, frightened, or reading from a script, even when the words themselves said nothing of the kind. Drexel Analytics used her constantly. They just didn't know her name. She worked on level 4 in the audio analysis unit, surrounded by servers and noise-canceling headphones and a quietly devastating collection of cold brew coffees that she consumed at a rate her doctor had politely flagged as concerning. Her supervisor, Blaine Archer, was the kind of man who smiled with all his teeth and none of his eyes. He submitted Talia's reports with his own name on the executive summary line. She had flagged it twice in her first year. She hadn't made that mistake again. It was a Tuesday in November when Talia found it. She had been assigned a routine transcription job, 9 hours of intercepted phone recordings pulled from an active DOJ investigation into a Chicago city councilman named Pruitt, who was suspected of channeling municipal construction contracts towards specific vendors in exchange for cash payments. Boring, methodical, painstaking work, the kind of work that made other analysts' eyes glaze over after the first 2 hours. Talia had been on hour 6 when she stopped the audio on a recording time-stamped 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday 3 weeks prior. She played the segment again, then a third time. There were 2 voices on the call. The first was Councilman Pruitt. She had already confirmed his voice print against the reference samples in the case file. The second voice was listed as unknown subject 2. The investigative team had been trying to identify it for 6 weeks. Talia knew it in 40 seconds. She had processed enough audio from Drexel Analytics' own internal archive to have catalogued the voice without ever intending to. The slight elongation of certain vowels, the particular rhythm of the phrasing, the way the speaker dropped the terminal consonant on words ending in a hard T when talking quickly. It was distinctive the way a fingerprint was distinctive, entirely unique to a single human larynx. The voice on the recording belonged to Oswald Drexel. Caspian Drexel's father, the founder of the firm Talia had spent 7 years of her career working for. Her coffee went cold beside her elbow while she sat completely motionless, the audio looping in her headphones for the 14th time. She was absolutely certain. She had never been wrong about a voice in 7 years of professional work. She was not wrong now. Oswald Drexel was on a federal wiretap, directing a sitting city councilman to funnel $11.3 million in public construction contracts through 3 shell companies that Oswald controlled through a Geneva-registered holding firm. The language was careful, elliptical, deniable, but Talia had built an entire career on hearing what language tried to hide. She removed her headphones. Her hands were not shaking. She had not yet given them permission to. The protocol was clear. Anomalous findings above a certain threshold went to Blaine Archer for escalation to the director's office. Talia had never liked the protocol, but she had always followed it. She followed it now. She found Blaine in the 4th floor break room at 6:48 in the evening, the rest of their unit long gone home. She explained what she had found, methodically, without embellishment, the way she always delivered her work. She told him about the voice print match. She told him about the shell companies and the holding firm in Geneva. She told him she had the timestamps. Blaine Archer listened with his arms crossed and his jaw doing something complicated. Then his hand shot out and closed around her wrist. He was not a large man. He was actually slightly shorter than Talia, but the grip was vicious, and he used it to spin her sideways, backing her into the corner of the break room behind the door where the security camera had a blind spot. She had never thought to notice the blind spot before. "You are going to go back downstairs," Blaine said, his voice low and very controlled, "and you are going to delete the timestamp logs and flag that segment as non-actionable ambient noise, and then you are going to go home and forget that your ears work." Talia tried to pull her arm back. His fingers tightened to the bone. "Oswald Drexel is the reason every single person in this building has a job," Blaine said, "including you." He stopped himself. Something shifted behind his eyes, calculating and cold. "You have no idea what you just put your hands on. Delete the logs, Talia. I am not asking twice." He released her arm with a shove that sent her into the edge of the counter, and then he walked out. Talia stood in the break room alone. Her wrist ached, her eyes were dry. She was taking inventory, not of her feelings, which she had temporarily relocated somewhere she couldn't easily access, but of her options, which were fewer and more dangerous than they had been 40 minutes ago. She went back downstairs. She did not delete the logs. She copied everything, the audio files, her voice print analysis, the timestamp records, her written assessment, onto an encrypted drive she kept in the inside pocket of her work bag, for exactly the kind of nothing she had always hoped this drive would never be needed for. Then she shut down her workstation, put on her coat, and took the elevator to the lobby. She cried in her car in the parking structure for approximately 9 minutes. Then she drove home. Her apartment was a 2-bedroom in Logan Square, with a drafty kitchen window and a bookcase that covered the entire north wall. She bolted both locks. She sat on the edge of her couch in her coat and looked at the bruising developing on her wrist and the inside of her forearm where Blaine had gripped her. The marks were purple and precise, the exact width of a man's fingers. She had already decided to quit when her phone rang at 6:17 the following morning, Drexel Analytics' main line, which was peculiar since the main line was for clients. The woman on the other end had a flat, professional voice and no apparent interest in pleasantries. "Mr. Drexel would like to meet with you this morning, Ms. Grayson. A car will be at your address in 20 minutes. She didn't specify which Mr. Drexel. The 42nd floor of the Drexel Analytics building was not a floor that Level 4 audio analyst visited. Talia had not known it existed in any practical sense. It was simply the number above 41 on the elevator panel, a closed concept. Now the elevator doors opened directly into a space that felt nothing like the corporate, utilitarian floors below. The office was enormous and dark-toned, all matte black steel and glass and leather, the kind of design that spent serious money appearing to spend no money at all. One full wall was a window overlooking the river, and beyond it, the jagged winter skyline of downtown Chicago. The light outside was steel gray and flat, the kind of November morning that had given up on being promising. Caspian Drexel was standing at the window with his back to the elevator. Talia knew his face the way any employee of his company knew it, from the annual report, from the framed photograph in the lobby, from the gossip that filtered through the building like weather. She was not prepared for the actual fact of him. He was taller than the photograph suggested, broad across the shoulders in a charcoal suit that clearly had not come off any rack. His hair was dark, cut short at the sides and left longer on top, and when he turned from the window, the overall impression was of something carefully controlled, a man who had learned to keep the dangerous parts very quiet. "Talia," he said, not a question. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit down." She sat. She pulled her wool coat tighter around herself without thinking. She had forgotten, in the strangeness of the morning, to change out of yesterday's clothes. She looked terrible, and she knew it, and she was too frightened to care. Caspian walked back to his desk and sat across from her. He studied her for a moment, with the kind of focused, assessing attention she was more accustomed to receiving from audio files than from actual humans. "Blaine Archer submitted an anomalous access flag this morning," he said. "Files he claims you copied without authorization." A pause. "Blaine Archer has also requested a meeting with my father this afternoon, which is unusual." Another pause, fractional and precise. "Tell me what you found." Talia reached into her coat pocket and set the encrypted drive on his desk. "The voice on the recording," she said, "the one your investigative team has been trying to identify for 6 weeks. It's your father." The silence in the office was absolute. "I know what I heard," she said, because her voice was going to shake if she didn't keep it moving. "I've been running voice print analysis for 7 years. I've never been wrong." The elongated vowel pattern, the dropped terminal consonants at pace, the specific cadence on compound sentences. It's his voice. I have 40 seconds of reference audio from your own archive that confirms the waveform comparison. Caspian had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not disbelief, not anger. Something more complex and more interior than either. He stood up slowly, and the movement triggered something old and involuntary in Talia's nervous system before her brain could intervene. She stepped back, one fast, flinching step, her shoulder blades meeting the glass behind her. "Don't," she breathed. Caspian stopped, his hand, which had been rising toward the drive on the desk, a simple reaching gesture, nothing more, dropped to his side. His eyes went to her shoulder, where the sudden movement had shifted her collar and left visible, in the flat winter light, the bruising along her upper arm and the top of her wrist. The air in the room changed its entire quality. "Tell me his name," Caspian said. It took her 3 seconds. The look on his face wasn't pity. It wasn't the polite, carefully managed discomfort she'd learned to expect from men who looked at the space she occupied and found it inconvenient. It was something that looked like fury, clean and directional, and pointed entirely away from her. "Blaine," she said, "last night in the break room." Caspian turned slightly. There was a man standing near the elevator. She had not registered him when she arrived. Dark jacket, the particular posture of someone trained to stand in rooms without being noticed. "Gaza," Caspian said. "Find Archer. He doesn't make that meeting with my father this afternoon." Gaza vanished. Caspian came back around to her side of the desk and sat, this time pulling his chair level with hers, rather than across from her, which was such an unexpectedly deliberate gesture that it landed harder than almost anything else that morning. "The drive," he said quietly. "Walk me through everything on it." By noon, Talia had eaten a sandwich she didn't remember ordering, and had laid out every layer of the analysis she'd spent years never imagining she'd need to use. Caspian listened the way she wished every client had ever listened, without interrupting, without finishing her sentences, without reaching for his phone. When she finished, he asked 3 specific and intelligent questions that told her he had absorbed everything she'd said. Then he told her she couldn't go home. "Blaine knew you had the drive before you left the building last night," Caspian said. "He was standing at the window again, facing the river, which means my father knows by now. If you walk into the FBI field office with those files, the lead investigator on the Pruitt case has a relationship with my father's attorneys that would put your evidence in Oswald's hands before 5 o'clock. Talia looked at the man who ran the most powerful private intelligence firm in Chicago, the man whose father had just been exposed as a criminal by a woman he'd never met, and tried to calibrate how much she should trust him. She thought about Blaine's face in the break room, the calculating pause before he'd let go of her arm. "Where then?" she said. Caspian's private residence occupied the top 2 floors of a building in the Gold Coast that she had walked past 100 times without thinking about who lived in it. The elevator opened into a space that was colder and more spare than she expected. Less a display of wealth than a demonstration of it, the kind of apartment where everything present served a purpose and nothing was decorative. He gave her clothes. Not a borrowed approximation she'd expected, but something that had clearly been sourced by someone who paid attention. Soft cashmere, wide-leg trousers in a deep charcoal, a knit pullover that was the most comfortable thing she had worn in longer than she could accurately remember. She changed in the guest bathroom and made the mistake of looking at herself in the mirror for a moment before she could stop herself. The bruising on her arm had darkened overnight, purple-black against pale skin, the kind that came from real force applied with real intent. She put the pullover on and went back out. Caspian was at the kitchen island with 2 cups of coffee, and his phone face down on the counter, which she suspected was a deliberate gesture. "Your analyst," Talia said, sitting across from him, "the one who handles digital forensics." "Vesper, what do you need?" "If she can pull the financial back-end on the 3 shell companies, I can map the language in the transaction records. Corporate structuring documents carry linguistic fingerprints the same way audio does. I've done it before." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "If there's a communication trail between your father and whoever built the structures, I'll find the signature." Caspian looked at her for a moment. Not at her size, not at her second-hand looking coat, still draped over the back of the chair. He looked at her with the focus of a man who had just been handed something genuinely valuable. "How long do you need?" he said. "Give me access in 6 hours." She needed 7. She set up at the dining room table with Vesper's laptop array and a second monitor Caspian had pulled from a back office without being asked. She hadn't touched the lunch someone left beside her elbow, but she worked through 4 cups of coffee and lost herself completely in the numbers and the language, which was the only place she had ever felt entirely safe. Caspian did not hover. He appeared occasionally in her peripheral vision, on the phone in the hallway, speaking low and fast in what she was fairly certain was Italian, standing at the window with a glass of water and a document she couldn't read. Once, when she had gone very quiet for longer than usual, he appeared beside her and set down a plate of food without saying anything at all, then walked away again. She ate it without looking up from the monitor. At 11:46 at night, she found the thread. Caspian. He appeared in the doorway in 30 seconds. His jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. She registered, without particularly meaning to, that he had been there the entire evening. Not gone, not retreated, simply present somewhere in the apartment in a way that felt less like a security arrangement and more like something she didn't have a ready word for. She pointed at the screen. The shell companies all use identical subordinate clause structures in their incorporation filings, she said. It's not something a casual reader would notice. But someone drafted all three documents, the same someone, and this phrasing here, she highlighted a line, appears in 17 emails between the law firm managing the structures and the Geneva holding company. It's a highly specific formulation. Archaic, almost. Whoever wrote it has a legal background, and English as a second language. Slavic root, likely Polish or Czech. Caspian leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. Close enough that she could have reached back and touched him. My father's senior legal counsel, he said. His voice had gone very flat. Marek Dobrowski, born in Krakow, retired officially 4 years ago. Not retired, Talia said. No, a long beat, not retired. She printed the analysis, 63 pages of cross-referenced linguistic evidence, voice print comparison and financial mapping, enough to establish a clear and documentable chain between Oswald Drexel-Kelman Pruitt and $11.3 million in diverted public funds. She stacked it neatly and looked at it. There's a federal prosecutor, Caspian said. In the Northern District. She's been adversarial to my father since 2019 and she is not in his network. I have her direct contact. Talia nodded. The apartment went quiet. The city outside was still doing its work. Lights, movement, the distant sound of a train along the elevated line. But up here it was just the two of them, and the evidence and the particular stillness that settles after a very long day of being afraid. I want to say something, Talia said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the stack of papers. I've been at your company for 7 years. I've been the person nobody notices for most of that time. And I know that's... She paused. I know part of that is this. She gestured briefly at herself. What I look like. What I am. The kind of woman that a man like Blaine Archer thinks he can put his hands on, because who is ever going to believe her? She stopped. She had not planned to say that much. Caspian sat down across from her at the dining room table. He didn't fill the silence immediately, which was either kindness or understanding. She couldn't decide which, and both felt equally unfamiliar. I noticed you, he said. 8 months ago, a voice print analysis on the Harrington matter. I asked Blaine about the analyst. He told me it was his work. A pause. I should have looked harder. Talia finally looked at him. You're going to feel sorry for me, she said. I don't want that. No, he said. I'm angry. There's a difference. She believed him. The window beside the dining room table exploded inward at 12:23 a.m. Not the glass itself. A concussive charge fired against the exterior of the building, designed to breach and disorient. Talia was out of her chair before the sound fully registered, driven by something more primitive than thought. The lights died simultaneously. Somewhere deeper in the apartment, an alarm began to scream. Caspian was already moving. He reached for her arm. Carefully, she registered distantly, his hand landing above the bruising, and pulled her toward the interior hallway. Secondary stairwell, he said. His voice was entirely level, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it. Gaza materialized from somewhere with a tactical flashlight and a very serious-looking firearm, and a second man behind him that Talia hadn't known was in the apartment. 2 through the service entrance, Gaza said. They used Oswald's clearance code. Caspian said something under his breath that was not fit for polite company. Talia grabbed the 63-page analysis off the table and shoved it into her messenger bag along with the drive. Nobody told her to. It was simply the only coherent thought she had. This evidence does not disappear tonight. The hallway was dark and disorienting. Gaza went first, Caspian just behind Talia, his presence steady at her back. They made it 12 feet before the door at the far end opened. A figure stepped through. Not Gaza's people, someone else entirely bigger, in dark tactical gear that didn't come from civilian suppliers. The weapon came up fast. Talia saw it before Gaza did. She didn't think. She threw her entire body sideways, shoulder into the intruder's extended arm at the moment the trigger pulled. The shot went wide, punching into the ceiling above them. The man backhanded her reflexively, a vicious strike that sent her into the wall, her vision fracturing into sparks, her knees going uncertain beneath her. Gaza had the intruder on the floor in the next 3 seconds. Caspian was beside her before she had finished sliding down the wall, both hands on her face, checking her temple. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice came from somewhere far away. "I'm fine, I'm fine." Talia, whatever control he had maintained through the entire evening, was absent from his voice now. There was something unguarded in it, something close to a fracture. "You could have." "I know." She became aware that she was gripping his shirt in both fists. She made her hands release it. "The papers are in my bag. I held on to them." He made a sound that was either a curse or a laugh, possibly both, and pressed his forehead against hers for one brief, still moment in the dark. "Then we're going," he said. They were in a car 40 minutes later, moving through the pre-dawn silence of a Chicago that didn't know anything had happened. Talia sat in the back seat with her messenger bag in her lap and Caspian beside her, and the city sliding past the tinted windows like something from another life. "Oswald already has attorneys moving," Gaza said from the front. "But the Pruitt investigation is federal. If we get those files to the prosecutor in the Northern District tonight, the warrant can be in front of a judge before sunrise." "Make the call," Caspian said. Gaza called. Talia looked out the window. The river was dark and moving, the lights of the bridges reflected in long, unsteady columns on the water. "I would have quit," she said quietly. "Yesterday morning, I was going to write a resignation letter before the car showed up." "I know," Caspian said. "Blaine pulled your personnel file at 6:52 p.m. You were already visible to them before you left the building." She turned to look at him. "You were already investigating." "I started the moment the anomalous access flag hit my dashboard." His jaw was set in a way that had nothing to do with the immediate danger and everything to do with something older. "Blaine is currently in a room in a facility I own, explaining in considerable detail how long he has been working for my father and who else is involved." He stopped. A hairline fracture appeared in the control. "My father built this company so that I would build it into something he could use. I've spent 12 years believing I was building it myself." Talia said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't too small for that particular silence. After a moment, Caspian looked at her. In the ambient light from the city, his face was tired and certain at the same time. 7 years, he said. "You were in my building. You were the sharpest analyst in my organization, and I didn't know your name." He reached across and covered her hand where it rested on the messenger bag, deliberate, careful of the bruising, warm and unhurried in a way that made her throat tighten. "Whatever comes next, the investigation, the fallout, all of it, you don't navigate it alone. You have my word." She looked at his hand over hers. She looked at the city moving past the window. She thought about 7 years of being furniture, of having her work returned to her with someone else's name on it, of learning to make herself small in rooms that were never going to make space for her anyway. "I'm not small," she said. She hadn't planned to say it out loud. "No," Caspian said, "you're not." The evidence reached the federal prosecutor's secure server at 3:41 a.m. At 4:17 a.m., a judge in the Northern District of Illinois signed an asset freeze order against 3 shell companies, a Geneva holding firm, and one Oswald Drexel, founder and chairman emeritus of Drexel Analytics. At 4:19 a.m., Caspian's phone rang. He looked at the screen, then at Talia. "My father," he said. He answered it. He didn't speak first. Oswald Drexel spoke for 41 seconds. Talia couldn't hear the words. She could hear the tone, cold and precise, with the particular cadence she had spent 6 hours listening to on a loop, the voice she had known in 40 seconds and been absolutely right about. The voice that had started all of this. When it ended, Caspian set the phone face down on the seat between them. "What did he say?" Talia asked. He told me I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. A pause. He also said that one quiet girl in accounting had burned 12 years of his work to the ground. His voice was flat and certain. He meant it as an insult. Talia looked at the city lights, still burning through the early morning dark, the lake somewhere beyond the skyline doing whatever Lake Michigan did in November, cold and vast and entirely indifferent to the things people built on its shore. "It isn't one," Caspian said. She knew. The car moved through the empty streets of Chicago, and somewhere behind them, in offices and courtrooms and federal databases, the walls Oswald Drexel had spent a decade constructing were beginning to understand that morning was coming. Talia Grayson had spent 7 years making herself invisible. She had kept her head down and her ears sharp, and she had been the best at what she did in every room she was never credited for entering. She had heard the voice that 6 weeks of investigation had missed. She had held on to the papers through a firefight in the dark. She was not invisible anymore. And the man sitting beside her, with his hand still resting over hers, 12 years of calculated betrayal burning quietly behind his eyes, a war with his own blood already in motion, had already begun making sure she never had to be again.